Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each week to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes and open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. It's been another tumultuous week in Israel. It started really on Monday with the passing of the first reading. We should remember it's only the first of three readings of a law that would end the Supreme Court's ability to use what's been called the reasonableness clause to overturn government decisions. Let's just take a step back to see how we got here. Ever since this government came in, there's been talk of judicial reform. And obviously, anyone who's been following the situation in Israel knows that there's been mass protests and opposition to the idea of judicial reform, or at least the proposals that were put forward at the beginning, especially the idea that everything would be sort of passed in one go, the ability of the composition of the current Judicial Appointments Committee, the ability of the Supreme Court to strike down laws, this reasonableness clause, and a host of other reforms. When there was great pushback, not just from the streets with hundreds of thousands taken to the streets against it, but also international reactions, specifically from the US, but also from other partners from Europe and elsewhere, from the Jewish world, from NGOs, from organizational heads, et cetera, then that basically pushed the situation where Netanyahu decided he would not be able to pass everything in one go. And what he would do is he would then do what's been described as the salami method, which means they'll do this piece by piece. Netanyahu has said that there's certain things that he's completely removed from the table, or at least that's what he says to the outside world in foreign media interviews, like the taking away the ability of the Supreme Court to override government decisions. He said that's off the table, but here in Israel, he said it's on the table. And that goes very much to the tightrope walk that Prime Minister Netanyahu is doing at the moment. What happened this week, as I said, is according to the opposition at least, or the opponents on the street, more so even than those in the Knesset, was to take the concept or the ability of the Supreme Court to strike down decisions on the basis of what's being called the reasonableness clause. That means it's not specifically any one law that overrules, that the justices can say overrules a particular decision, but whether the act or the policy or the law itself is reasonable. Now, that's very controversial because if one looks at the origins of the reasonableness clause, they actually go back to 1948 in the UK. That was where the president was said. And the precedent itself was that any decision or law that any reasonable person would find objectionable. Now, that means only in very extreme cases would this reasonableness clause be enacted. Israel's judicial bench, Supreme Court bench, led by Aaron Barak, which was very much part of the judicial revolution, basically extended that to anything that they felt was unfair, unreasonable, etc. This really, in essence, is probably the weakest part of the judicial reform. This taking away the ability of the Supreme Court to rule on the basis of reasonableness was actually even conceded behind closed doors at the president's residence by the opposition in negotiations over government reform. It's probably the thing that most opponents would readily agree to, as long as it doesn't interfere in the justices' ability to strike down the ability of the government to appoint people. For example, Aryeh Deri was removed from his position because the Supreme Court said it was unreasonable that he serve as a minister after being convicted of fraud and all the other things in the past, accepting a plea bargain, etc., etc. And they forced Prime Minister Netanyahu to remove Aryeh Deri from his position. That part, which worries many of the judicial reform opponents, was actually not even part of this law. So as I said, this law that was passed on Monday was, for let's say, most moderates in the opposition, not the most significant part of judicial reform, yet for the opponents on the street, especially those who are running the demonstrations, this was still very much a bone of contention, and they felt that this was a threat to democracy. They took to the streets on Tuesday after the passage of the law. It passed by 64 to 56, which is along coalition opposition lines. We did see massive demonstrations at the airport, around Tel Aviv, around Jerusalem, around many places throughout the country. And it basically sent a very strong message to Netanyahu that we're not going to allow you to do anything. We're not going to allow you to pass even the weakest, quote unquote, of the judicial reforms. But basically, what this really does is puts Netanyahu in a bit of a quandary, because he sees that the effect that the demonstrations are having on the Israeli economy. He sees the effect that the demonstrations are having on security. For example, there have been quite a few petitions over previous months by Air Force pilots, by people in intelligence agencies, in Israel's hallowed 8,200 unit. People say that they will refuse to serve if there is judicial reform. And we saw yesterday that 4 pilots did not come to serve in their units. And apparently, according to recordings behind closed doors, this enraged Netanyahu, who made the point that we cannot have a scenario where people do not come and do their service. This endangers Israel's security. It doesn't matter if it's from this side or that side. We cannot have that situation. But the fact is that situation is happening, which is really causing a lot of problems for Netanyahu at home and abroad. What we saw this morning or yesterday, I should say, was a New York Times editorial by Thomas Friedman, which basically claimed that the US administration, the Biden administration, was reassessing US-Israel ties. Now, that caused quite a tremor throughout Israel, because it is known that Thomas Friedman is close to the Democrats, close to democratic administrations, to a certain extent, even a mouthpiece for them. So the fact that they put out this balloon, let's say, certainly caused great worry, even if there was subsequent denials by the US officials, by Netanyahu's office, by the Israeli government. But the fact that it was put out there means that they wanted to send a message to Israel. And at the moment, the American administration is very much using a policy of carrots and sticks towards Israel. And what I mean by that is the stick is these criticisms. Biden himself was on CNN, I believe it was, where he called this government the most extreme. He rallied against this government, against Netanyahu's ability to govern. Ambassador Nides, who is leaving Israel, he's finishing his tenure as US ambassador to Israel, also made very harsh criticisms against this government. And now we have this Thomas Friedman article. This really is sending a very strong message to Netanyahu that the US is extremely displeased. I don't believe that there really isn't a reassessment of relations. Certainly there are disagreements. There have been disagreements throughout the history of the US-Israel relationship, but it's more there to scare this Israeli government. And that's pretty much the stick. The carrot is something which we've talked about in recent weeks, is the Saudi normalization. Now, as I've spoken about previously, the Saudi-Israel normalization agreement, potential agreement, isn't really at this point about Saudi Arabia or Israel relations, because Saudi Arabia isn't really asking anything from Israel, and Israel really isn't demanding anything from Saudi Arabia. The only thing that's left to be resolved are whether Saudi Arabia can get or can achieve its demands of the US. So really, the ball is in America's court, but the American administration, I should say the Biden administration, is very much sending messages to Israel through normal diplomatic channels, through the media, through anonymous quotes, that there can be no normalization while this Israeli government is acting the way it is in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, with judicial reform, etc., etc. So it's claiming that if it would just give up these policies, Israel-Saudi normalization is just around the corner. But, for those who know behind the scenes, as I said, it's not really about what Israel does or doesn't do. It's really about America. But that is the policy that it's very much using. A week today, President Herzog is going to the US. He is going to present, or he's going to speak at the US Congress. This is an interesting situation because it's pretty rare that an Israeli president will get an invitation, and I'm sure he'll be meeting with President Biden as well. Usually President Biden usually does these things, or the president does these things last minute. I'm sure he'll get an audience with President Biden, and that will send a message really to Netanyahu that while our relations, US-Israel relations, are strong, I'm ignoring you. I'm keeping a sort of arm's distance from you. I'm sending a message to the Israeli people that I'm not against you. I'm not against the state of Israel, but I am against this quote unquote extremist government. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens. I'm sure Netanyahu is certainly not happy about this invitation to President Herzog, but it'll be interesting to see exactly what the messages that come out, if there is indeed that meeting at the White House, and what exactly is happening there. Closer to home, Netanyahu certainly does have a headache on his hands with his coalition because, as I said, while the opposition are very much against this reasonableness law that passed its first reading, and it's this is the law that Netanyahu has promised will be passed through all three readings by the end of this current Knesset period, which is at the end of the month. They're really looking for far more. They're looking really to change the composition of the Judicial Appointments Committee. Itamar Ben-Gvir came on the news today to really send that message, saying also that he will not accept any dilution of the reasonableness clause as it goes through the second and third reading. As we know, usually what happens with a bill is it will go through its first reading, then it will go back to committee. In this case, it will go to the Law and Constitutional Committee run by Simcha Rotman, who chairs it, who is very much one of the proponents of judicial reform, and certainly a judicial reform maximalist. And so basically, he will try and keep it as much as possible that went through the first reading. Netanyahu will want to make it probably a little bit softer, will want to take into account some of the criticisms. For example, one of the criticisms was that in the law it said not just the decisions of the prime minister and ministers, but also other officials. And there's a concern that that could extend to mayors and municipal heads and basically make it much wider than Simcha Rotman, for example, would claim it is. But now it'd be very interesting to see how much control Netanyahu has, because if this law really does go through the second and third readings, untouched, undiluted, then that could be a problem for Netanyahu. And that means that probably people like Simcha Rotman, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Yariv Levin, his justice minister, are far more in control than he would like. And then we get to the summer recess and then the Jewish holidays. And afterwards, Netanyahu has promised to allow other parts of the reform to be pushed forward. So that's really where the eyes of both the proponents and the opponents of judicial reform are at this point. There were massive demonstrations really showing the strength of opposition in Israel to judicial reform. And certainly that will be noticed by Netanyahu, but it will also be noticed by Netanyahu's allies around the world, including in DC, in the White House and elsewhere. And certainly they'll be watching exactly the minutiae of the details of this reasonableness clause, because this has become very much a test case to see, A, who's in control of judicial reform and how far it's going to go. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you so much. So the first question is from Eric, stating some Jewish liberal groups are accusing Netanyahu of engaging in Jenin with Hamas and Hezbollah to distract the public from focusing on judicial changes. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, interestingly enough, there's been a lot of attacks from the opposition, especially the right-wing elements of the opposition, that Netanyahu has not been fighting terror enough. And certainly, factually, to a certain extent, that is true. The Bennett-Lapid government, especially towards the end, was in places like Jenin almost on a daily or nightly basis, trying to root out terror and trying to prevent attacks and trying to arrest or take out terrorists on their way to attacks. So Netanyahu government didn't do it, certainly at the beginning, in quite the same ferocity, let's say. And there have been a number of terror attacks recently. So there is quite a clamor from all quarters for there to be a stronger approach. And what we do know is that Iran especially has been putting a lot of resources into Jenin. Jenin, especially the refugee camp within Jenin, has become a bit of a safe haven for terrorists and terrorist sympathizers, terrorist organizations. So this operation by the IDF into Jenin was something warranted. I don't think there's too many suggestions within the Israeli security establishment that this wasn't warranted. It certainly was warranted. And not to say that Netanyahu wouldn't want a distraction from this, but it certainly was very much warranted. I think you'd have to be on the really, really far left in Israel to find too many voices who would share that opinion. I don't know who in the American Jewish liberal establishment who has said that, so I can't comment on that. But in Israel, that would be a very minor sort of thought process.
Thank you. David Levine points out the BBC and other government news outlets have libeled Israel for its actions in Jenin, accusing it of purposely killing children. What, if anything, can the government of Israel do to counteract such distortions?
Well, if we knew the answer to that, that would be the silver bullet. Israel has been dealing with the foreign media, let's say bias for many, many years. There's not much it can do. It is a democracy. It allows reporters full access. It allows international reporters. It allows local reporters. It allows Palestinian reporters full access, pretty much on the ground. There's not much it can do if an editor in London, Paris, New York, Washington, wherever, decides to write what it writes. The facts remain that, while there have been criticisms, especially from, the human rights rapporteur, I can't remember her name, an Italian woman, who basically said that Israel's upsetting the international legal order, which is an absurd comment with all the human rights abuses and conflicts around the world, that it just shows that there's a natural bias. And some have even called her an anti-Semite. And the fact is, though, her comments and quotes are picked up and they're used to justify headlines. So there's really not much Israel can do. They didn't allow this woman to come in to Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, when she wanted to come, because it was clear that there was no real interest in gathering facts. She'd already decided that Israel was guilty of all manner of human rights violations and war crimes, as she puts it. So Israel didn't allow her in, just not to give her any sort of further legitimacy than she has. But at the end of the day, she still has a massive soapbox, and people like her, agencies like those that she works for, NGOs around the world who mirror and copy and parrot what they say, what she says and others say. It's pretty much copy paste. They're going to get picked up by the BBC. They're going to get picked up by the New York Times. They're going to get picked up by international news agencies. And there's really not much Israel can do. Israel can put out the facts as much as it can. Israel is become certainly pretty good at its messaging, or at least a lot better than it used to be. The IDF has social media channels. It tries to put out information in real time, tries to put out videos, it tries to put out pictures, it tries to present proof that it goes after terrorists. And the fact remains that the overwhelming majority of those that it kills are combatants. Even if they're claimed to be 17 years old, 5 minutes later, Hamas will bring out a picture and a video of them with a Hamas headband, with an AK-47, whatever it is in their hand, talking about how they want to become a martyr and all that sort of thing. So I'm confused exactly what critics of Israel would do with a 17-year-old with an assault rifle, or who would want to go and perpetrate a terrorist attack. Should Israel just ignore it because that person is considered underage? I mean, it's an absurd thought, but this is what Israel unfortunately has to deal with. And I'm not really sure, although we can certainly criticize Israel's public relations in certain areas, it's certainly getting better. But on the other hand, it really can't censor what international news organizations report.
Thank you. Before we get into the other issues you discussed today, Merdad Kansari asks, any update about the status of the kidnapped Israeli scholar in Iraq? Is there some kind of prisoner exchange plan with Iran?
This has only just been released to the public. This was obviously very sensitive information. There was a reason why it wasn't reported for months, probably because they didn't want to. Sometimes when these things are reported, then they become a lot more difficult. There's a lot more pressures, a lot more sensitivities. So the fact that they reported this now probably means that they've reached a dead end with behind-the-scenes diplomacy. There is talk of this exchange happening, but I really have no information beyond what's reported in the media. Obviously, Israel is doing as much as it can, as it would for any of its citizens kidnapped anywhere in the world, but I really don't know too much more beyond that.
Thank you. David S. Levine asks, why would the Saudi government care what Biden has to say about relations with Israel?
Because if we look at the Abraham Accords agreements, each of the countries pretty much got something from America alongside normalization with Israel. Obviously, normalization with Israel has its benefits, and the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco and other countries are certainly seeing that. But at the end of the day, they needed something a little bit more to get going. The UAE got up-to-date fighter jets. Morocco got recognition of its control over Western Sahara. I think it was Sudan got taken off the American terrorist supported countries supported terrorist list of countries supporting terrorists and various other things. So Saudi Arabia is certainly not going to do this for cheap, especially as their relationship with the Biden administration has certainly not been as good as it was under the Trump administration. And we saw this cold shoulder from the beginning, and it warmed up a little bit when the US needed Saudi oil and reserves and all that sort of thing. But the Saudis want assistance. They want assistance with a civilian nuclear program. They want some sort of defense treaty. They see the rise of Iran in the region. They see Iran's hurtling towards nuclear weapons capability, and they want certain guarantees from the US. At this point, that's more important to them than anything else. And the Saudis believe that the US wants normalization with Saudi Arabia. And quite frankly, I'm sure in the lead up to Joe Biden's re-election bid, it would be nice to have some sort of signing on the White House lawn between Saudi and Israeli leaders. But also, as I said in my earlier remarks, he also doesn't want to give this as a prize to Netanyahu when he feels that Netanyahu's government is more extreme and is creating problems in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, judicial reform, et cetera, et cetera. So it's probably the Biden administration at this point, from what we see, is far more intent on just dangling that carrot there, keeping the Saudis at arm's length, trying to explain to the Israelis that the Israeli government that it's their actions which is preventing this normalization, whereas at the end of the day, it's really the US that can make this deal happen.
Thank you so much. Don Sable asks, was it former Chief Justice Barak who came up with the starting and the application of the reasonableness standard? And in the proposed legislation, if the reasonableness standard is disallowed, is there something to be used instead, suggested or proposed in the law? In addition, what might have been applied before the reasonableness standard was initiated?
That's quite a lot. Well, no, it wasn't former Chief Justice Barak. As I said, it actually goes back to British law in 1948. I actually did a bit of research on this, so that's how I know that. But it was adopted in a more extreme nature in Israel. In other words, a wider nature by Barak and those who sat on the bench with him and those who followed him. Up until that point, it hadn't been used in Israel. Israel existed for 40-something, 50 years, whatever it is, without the use of reasonableness, especially in its sense that's being used today. The judicial reform proponents would say that it's unnecessary because there are laws on the statute books, and if a justice cannot find a law that specifically, ensures that a government policy should be made illegal, then there's no reason for them to do so. What they claim is that if the defense minister decides on a particular policy, he is taking into account all the professional advice on economic issues, security issues, all sorts of planes, whereas the justice ministers don't understand and are not privy to many of these discussions, many of these calculations, many of all the different advices that they're getting. So how can they be able to overturn a decision policy based pretty much on their own view of the situation? Don't forget, using unreasonableness means that there is not a specific law that's being contravened. It means that the justice has suggested or has said that the policy or the law itself is just not reasonable, which proponents, let's say, of judicial reform would say is undemocratic, because it's the democratically elected representatives who should decide policy. It shouldn't be for the justices who are not democratically elected to decide for or against a particular policy. Of course, there are many jurists and experts who would argue that the truth is somewhere in the middle. Perhaps there should be a more limited use of reasonableness, something more aligned with its original use. As I said, in many other countries around the world, there is the ability to use reasonableness, but it's certainly not as broadly used as it is in the Israeli context. So there isn't something to be put instead, because what proponents of judicial reform would say is you have hundreds, if not thousands, of laws. You can check all of these to see that if a particular policy or particular law is not contravening something else. Don't forget, there are basic laws against discrimination, against all these things. So you don't really need reasonableness to base something that's, the government policy is discriminatory. You already have a law. So proponents would say that there's enough already in there to ensure that you don't need reasonableness. And if there isn't, then the proper place is the legislature to legislate and fix those gaping holes.
Thank you so much. Carrie Hillebrand and Eric both ask about, has Israel reached a decision as to how to react to the Hezbollah intrusion into Israeli territory near Hardav?
It's still trial diplomacy. Basically, Amos Hochstein, who is the US mediator, was in the region. What it now appears is happening is Hezbollah very much trying to use these tents as a negotiating tactic to try and ensure that the fence, it's quite a complicated issue, but when Israel removed itself from southern Lebanon, it did according to what the UN decided was the demarcated border. Hezbollah disputes, I think it's 14 points of that demarcated border. And as I said, that was a UN demarcated, the so-called blue line. One of these places is a village called Raja in the north. And basically, Hezbollah say that part of it is part of Lebanon, the northern part. And Israel has put a fence around the northernmost part, which means it's all inside Israel. Hezbollah demand that fence be removed. And it's now suggesting to the US mediator, it seems, that it will remove its tents if Israel removes its fence from the northern part of the village of Rajah. So it seems like it's being played up diplomatically at this point. Hezbollah did try again to try and get across the border at other points. It's certainly ratcheting up the heat on the border, but at the moment the tents remain.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us this week.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Of course, for our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Edward Lutwick discussing focus on Palestinians, not their leaders. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.